Hello, welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you, Jack. It's a real pleasure to be on your podcast. Thank you for inviting me.
No, it's my pleasure. So maybe just kick off because I try and explain the society um, as best I can, but I've only been in it for a year. So you've been doing this for many years.
Few years.
So maybe you could just explain a bit about your background and how you came to the society and what it is, and just try to condense all that down into.
It'd be a pleasure, though. I'm sure, actually, your introductions, I'm sure, might be more meaningful to a lot of people than mine. So it's great that you're doing it, and well done to you for doing it. Well, my background, I came into it. I was at university at the time, and I was really on the search. I mean, I'd actually been searching from the age of 14, quite consciously, knowingly. Like one day I got up and I'm on, it began at the age of 14. The day before I hadn't been that bothered. And it was a very crystal clear thing. And, I had thought that people, especially adults, must have looked into this and I was at a school called King's School Canterbury, where a lot of people were going to be priests at that school at that time, not so much now. It's connected to the cathedral. And I assumed that people would know some of the questions, the answers to them that I had, and I found that they didn't, in a nutshell. And it was quite disappointing, as a matter of fact, at that age. And so I carried on, basically got to university, turned to Eastern philosophy, which was actually quite trendy at that time, in the sort of early 70s. But it wasn't a trend to me. I really wanted to look into it. So I came at it almost through that yoga tradition. It's how I came across Dr. King, and particularly through his practice of prayer that he teaches, or his method of prayer, dynamic prayer, as he calls it. I was introduced to it by a very old friend of mine, very close friend of mine to this day, John Holder, who was at the same university, that's Hull University in the north of England. And he was giving a lecture on dynamic prayer at the Buddhist and Vedanta Society at Hull University. And I was in the audience. And I decided to try it. Went and tried it that night.
Okay.
And I didn't have any prayer to use, but I raised the hand, as we do in the Aetherius Society, raised the hands, visualized white light flowing through the palms of the hands. And I'd seen a sort of distressed tramp or somebody that earlier that day who looked in need in the street. So I decided to send him healing, and I visualized him being given healing just as we'd been taught. And I felt this incredible sensation. It was like physical.
Okay.
I'm not saying, by the way, everyone who does this will have that straight away at all. It was just one of those things. And I couldn't shake it off. I went to bed in the university where I was staying in the union buildings. It was still there. I was tingling all over. In fact, I was quite worried. I thought, look, what's happening? Is this ever going to stop? What's going on here? And it was on and off for several hours. So eventually I got out of bed and walked. This must have been in the early hours of the morning by then. I knew where the person who ran the Buddhist and Vedanta Society lived. And I walked to his house and knocked on his door.
At 2 a.m.
I said, something like that. I said, look, I went to your meeting and somebody gave this talk and I did the practice, and I've had these sensations going on ever since. I can feel this. I can feel that. What is it? I mean, he was a student, this person. He wasn't, I don't know. He was very nice considering that I was knocking on his door at that time. He said he didn't know, so I stayed there, and then he pointed me in the direction of John, and then I met up with John and found it came through the Aetherius Society, through Dr. King. The tingling did stop, by the way.
Okay.
I couldn't throw it off, and that started me on my quest. And then I pretty quickly realized that this did answer all my questions.
Okay.
Questions that the Dean of Canterbury Cathedral had just not been able to get close to be honest. And nor had some of the other things I'd looked into by then, and it just went from there. So I haven't introduced the Aetherius Society as you asked me to do at all at the moment, but what it is, it's
practical.
It's a set of teachings and a set of practices designed to help others, serve others, and it's extremely powerful, and to cooperate with intelligences from beyond this world who have communicated through Dr. George King, whose roots were in the science or the spiritual practice of yoga.
Okay, brilliant. That gives us a little chance to segue into that. So Dr. King, he reached these very high levels, but he was already so many people are born psychic, or they have some abilities that you've only got to watch TV. There's all these fanciful programs about it. So he was already in that direction, but then he started doing intensive practices for about 10 years. So how did he get started? Because this is after World War II. I mean, this is not even in the lectures on yoga, I'm sure. How did
No, funnily enough, I mean, I heard today that, I mean, the health service over here is advocating yoga to help people with their difficulties. So yoga is now, from a health point of view, is well accepted, but it certainly wasn't when Dr. King started practicing it, which would be 1945 or so,
Right.
somewhere around there. He had been extremely unusual. I mean, I will be straight about this. I believe he came from another world. I believe he was not of this earth. I believe he's in that tradition that the Hindus refer to as avatars. So Rama, Krishna, others from many traditions, not just Eastern ones, who've come here, came from another place at another time. I mean, Moses would be another one. And controversially, I believe Jesus would be another one. So there are a number, but I believe he was already of that ilk, as it were. But he had still, though, as he would put it, to throw a bridge over the stream of life, as it were, and he had to find his enlightenment himself in this particular life. He couldn't just, it wasn't just there. He had to work for it.
Okay.
But being extremely unusual, I was lucky to be a co-author of his biography recently. So I've spoken to lots of people, including people who knew him. And like his sister, for example, who I knew quite well, his late sister, who was 2 years younger than him, and his niece and others. And he was never just like an ordinary person. He was very humble, though, and quite shy and quite quiet. But he did have I mean, he was psychic as a child. He had healing power as a child. He had certain unusual experiences of what you might call powers from time to time in the years leading up to and after the war. Spiritual powers, I mean by that. But it was then that he really applied himself. He found really what he was looking for. I mean, his sister told me that because they were at one point sharing a flat in London, that he changed overnight. He found a yogi, particular yogi.
How did he find this then? How did he?
Well, he was on the lookout for it.
Okay, like you, yeah.
And so the theosophical movement then was probably bigger than it is now, very active, and there were a number of visiting yogis. I think, I can't be absolutely 100% sure of this, the yogi she was referring to is Shastri, Dr. Shastri.
Who was in London? Who did come to London?
Was in London,
Okay.
and he definitely studied under him at one point. And he had actually, you can still, I visited when writing the biography, his the place where he taught, which is still there. It's still a centre now.
Right.
You can go there if you're in London. It's in Notting Hill. But that wasn't the only thing he did. I mean, he studied much later under another yogi called Sri Nandi, but he was very much self-driven. I mean, he wasn't dependent on gurus particularly. He did learn from a number of people. He was very active in the spiritualist movement, which also was much bigger then. I would say more active then.
Like seances and things like that.
Exactly. And in England, and he was a medium himself. Right. He was a healer himself. One of his specialities was psychic self-defense. So he would perform exorcisms, and he was working in a whole variety. I suppose, whereas if you look at, say, if I think of two other great 20th century spiritual figures from the East, this one would be Gandhi, another would be Sivananda. To take those two, Sivananda spent many years training in medicine. So he did what you might call more of a material study as well as his spiritual disciplines. Gandhi, as we know, studied in law as well as being involved in politics. Whereas Dr. King's whole study, whole focus all the way through was on the inner planes, which is where his mission was focused, the spiritual planes. And he went at it in the way he went at everything. I mean, one thing I discovered from all the people I did talk to, particularly those who knew him before I did, because I didn't really get, as it were, close to him until the late 1970s. I knew him before then, but I started to get close in the late 70s. And from about 77, I suppose, I talked to him pretty well every day, or saw him, or I was with him. And I wanted to know whether people who'd known him when he was younger, whether it was the same Dr. King or whether he changed at some point. And I came to the conclusion that he was essentially the same Dr. King, the same George King, that he was always that single-minded focus. And if he decided to do something, he did it 101%.
Okay.
And so that was true of yoga.
Okay. So, because I came from a Buddhist background, and the study of the Buddha it's very well documented. I mean, he was very born, very rich, left his family, went into the wilderness, studied with this teacher, studied with that teacher, and, did all these intense yoga practices and meditation, and then achieved enlightenment. And with Jesus, it's those lost years. I think we know now through the mystics that Jesus went to study in, was it Tibet?
Yes, and traveled quite extensively, but yes, among the Himalayas, shall we say?
Right.
It was then, yeah.
The Tao Crest Monastery or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he did probably 10 years of very intense practice, because he was a healer before, and he was the special. So,
and he had powers on the physical plane a lot, the Master Jesus. He had these miracles, and different masters have different roles to perform, and how they can use those powers, which, these are intelligences who, if they were given free rein to their true selves, could virtually move mountains. I mean, they could do so many things, but they are limited by the karma, if you like, of being here. And so they're allocated, well, you can use your powers in that way because that is your mission. That's why you've come to Earth. And another master might have to work in a different way.
Okay. So they all had their own here for a mission. So
they had their own mission. Yeah.
But before they all embarked on this mission, they all have to raise Kundalini. They have to do this as part of probably the karmic balance. They have to do intensive practices.
And again, it would depend on their mission. I mean, I'm not in a position to be dogmatic and say that every avatar who's ever come here has raised the Kundalini to the extent, say, that Dr. King did. It would depend on their mission. It's possible they didn't all need to do that in that life, depending how long they were on Earth for and what they were required to do. But it would be, think about it, where they're coming from, these other planets that they come from, which I believe are in this solar system, they live an entirely elevated life in terms of consciousness. I mean, they have their own trials as well to deal with in service to others. But they are at a very elevated state of consciousness just by nature. That's their state of being. They're coming here and they're born into great, tremendous limitation. And this is not new to the Aetherius Society. I mean, it's depicted, interestingly, if you go back to the Ramayana, when they're talking about Rama, for example, he was born under in mortal conditions, and this was a terrible limitation for him. But their natural innate instinct would be to get back to that higher conscious state which they came. Yeah, so they will strive, and they did. And it may be that all of them raised the Kundalini in its entirety, but I don't know that. But certainly a number of them did, for sure, and Dr. King certainly did.
So this is after World War II, and so he's found a teacher. So he's working he has a full-time job at this time as well.
Yes.
So he comes home from work and then he does his practices, or does he get up early in the morning? How does he start?
So I should just mention one thing, which is that he was a conscientious objector in the Second World War, which is a very difficult thing to be, really. more than we might think now. I mean, it was really frowned upon by some people, and it could damage your career prospects and many things. And for him, it was especially difficult because he was by nature a fighter, strangely. And in his childhood, for example, his leaning was towards what you might call pugilistic sports, so fighting sports, such as fencing, such as boxing, such as rifle. He was a top marksman, quarterstaffing, which was an old medieval practice with a long pole, but it was a fighting sport. And these were things that he was really good at, that he was drawn to. So for him, it wasn't so much a question of not wanting to go to war. It was in fact, he was drawn by the excitement of it in one way. It was more of a sacrifice that was a part of him, and he describes it very brilliantly, I think, that said, "Thou shalt not kill," and he let that part win. Those are his words. I let that part win, which I think is a very interesting few words that we could all use, actually.
Well, we're all
in our lives. Yes, do we let that part win? That's 4 words I try to keep in my mind. Let that part win, because sometimes we know what we should do, but we don't want to do it. But if we let that part win, then we'll do it. And I don't speak as someone who's achieved that. It's a goal. It's a goal.
Okay,
so yeah. So that was his background, yes. So so he made that choice, and during the Second World War, he did take a very dangerous role, which was in the fire service, and particularly in the Blitz, and the bombing in London, and so on. And he did then use, as he was a section leader in the fire service, but he used his psychic abilities to discover sometimes bodies, and people knew that he had that ability in the rubble, for example, to know where to go and to direct people. He wasn't, I mean, as his sister said, he wasn't fearful at all. If there was a problem, he was always the first one in. So it wasn't his nature to retreat, as it might be as a more pacific person, would be more drawn to pacifism. He wasn't. He was a fighting person, but he did it because it was right. And it was actually stated later by the Master Aetherius that had he not done that, it would have been very difficult to use him in the mission that he was used for. Yeah. So, and he had an experience actually in a place called Torrington in Devon, where I believe, I don't know this, I know he had the experience there, that's for sure, but what he was told, I don't know, but it looks to me that that's when he was told not to fight. But I'm deducing that because he was 20, it was 1939. He said it was a very significant experience that dictated certain moves that he later made.
And all his friends going off to war, and everything.
Yeah, and he was, as I mentioned, a shy person. He came from a agricultural background, and so he wasn't a great socializer. Even his sister said, even when she knew him, he was always off in thought and thinking and striving for something higher, and not satisfied by things that would satisfy a lot of people. Satisfied her. He was always looking for something deeper, something more. He had a sense of mission, she said, right from the beginning. But no, nothing would stop him if he made his mind up. I mean, when he later started the Aetherius Society, it was extremely controversial. I mean, to talk about contacts with beings from other worlds then, in the 1950s, in England, he was ridiculed mercilessly for it in the press, as you can imagine. Even now, I mean, I did an interview today on Radio Sussex where they've had a lot of UFO sightings, and it's much. I mean, the climate has changed immensely, but even today, an interviewer had to ask me, "Do you think they'd been drinking too much?" It's pathetic, really, especially now. But on the whole, it's a very different climate because most people believe in such things. But then nothing, my point there is that nothing would stop him. He was extremely brave. Now, to your question as to how he regulated his day, I mean, he hasn't told me, and he hasn't told anyone that I know of, but certainly the impression I have from him is that the jobs that he did, and he did more than one job, but one of the jobs he did was driving, were simply to, as he put it in those days, to pay his way through university. And he'd be asked, as he was driving a taxi by a client, well, what do you do? He said, well, I'm doing this to pay my way through university. They said, oh, what university? He said, the University of Life. So that was his thing. So the job was just there to pay the way. I mean, he didn't have any income. He didn't have any private funds or inherited money or anything like that. In fact, he had to help his parents. So he needed to work, but that wasn't his motivating factor. So I think what he did, from what I gather, is that he would work whatever was required. He lived modestly, in a sort of in a bedsit in London. He didn't have materialistic desires. I mean, he did at one point race bikes, for example. He went to the Isle of Man and various places, but he wasn't a seeker for possessions at all. So I think he would work for long hours when he needed to, which you can do if you're a taxi driver. I mean, he did have other jobs as well. He was a commissionaire at an oil company at one point, but and then if he might have, say, days to spend in his yoga. I mean, I know of one meditation he did in Cornwall that lasted for 65 hours. So that was a little later, but that I think was 1955, I believe. But so it wouldn't literally maybe be 8 hours every day, between 4 and midnight or something, but that's how he averaged it out.
Okay. So this is obviously very intense, because I mean,
very intense. Yeah.
I mean, if you sit down for an hour in a meditation class, it's a long time, but should I give it 2 hours, maybe, some people might have done 3 hours maybe, but to do a long 8 hours of just imagine. So imagine if the practice is just meditation, it's just sitting there and not moving. It's just hard enough. But he didn't. What practices did he do besides that?
Well, the yoga I'm talking of isn't, just to be clear, just the physical asanas, which a lot of people now seem to think is yoga. Right. What was then called hatha yoga, might still sometimes be called hatha yoga, was just a branch. He did it, but it wasn't by any means his main focus. And by the way, I completely agree with what you just said. I mean, I've only done 8 hours of yoga practice once.
Okay.
That's because mainly he didn't really want his students doing that. And we didn't get much vacation when he was around, or holiday time. I mean, we got some, but not a lot. He wanted us to work for others.
Well, that's probably important. That's probably important to mention that it's not a podcast to advocate people to.
No.
This is the way of service is now.
It's something he needed to do for his mission.
So he could teach us.
It worked for him. Yeah. He had to sort of reach that very elevated state that he did reach in order to perform his mission. His main focus, his favorite, form of yoga was Jnana yoga, which is the yoga of wisdom. But you could only, in his eyes anyway, really practice that once you'd attained a level of meditation. And he was extremely strict about the meaning of the word meditation.
Okay.
Actually, through his years, he softened, I would say. That'd be my opinion. That as the years, but in later years, he would use that word a bit more softly than he did in his early years. But if you read, for example, a book called, which I know you've read, but a book called The 9 Freedoms, and I strongly recommend that book. It's my favorite book, actually. You'll see there his commentary, and this was written, I believe, in 1962. That commentary, or somewhere like that. So he's extremely demanding, as he is in some of his very early lectures that you can also get. They're brilliant lectures on man's mind, on develop your clairvoyant powers, on imagination, your only creative faculty. Some of those lectures that he gave, they were given in those very early years, in the early 60s. And I sense that in that period, he believed, and it's heartwarming, really. He believed that lots of people could do this. He had tremendous faith in people and what they might do and their potential. He never lost it, by the way, but he did, this is my observation, realize as the years went by that other people were not going to do what he did, and they weren't going to get to those levels.
Well,
So
what he did, he didn't even go to an ashram, did he? I mean, he did the
no,
center of London. I mean,
yeah,
the Buddha was on a mountain, Jesus in a monastery, all your
yeah,
meals are taken care of.
yeah.
To do it in the middle of a city is like, he didn't even go to the countryside for 5 years, did he? I mean, it's
No,
just mind boggling. That's
it is
so
mind-boggling. I
many
mean,
temptations,
no, I mean, he had a major Kundalini rise, for example, in Waterloo in London. If anyone knows Waterloo, I mean, it's even now, it's not a most sort of spiritual, elevated environment, but that's where he had it, and and it was so strong he had to run for hours after this rise, and this is during the years we're talking about, in order just to control it, because he was learning not just to raise it, but to control it. And he
to
did
rip the
really
doors off the telephone.
you're right. Yes, he wanted to phone his mother, who was, quite seriously ill. I mean, she could have died. And he went to a phone box, and in those days had these big old metal. People won't even know what a phone box is now. I do remember phone boxes, but he'd pulled the door, and the whole door came off. Now that was just because he had this supernormal strength because of the Kundalini rise.
Mm.
But he had to control. I think one of the miracles about the years we're talking about, which is sort of, I suppose, 50 up to 54 or 5, really,
Mhm.
is that he remained balanced, stable, coped with life, because nobody else around him was doing this. I mean,
Mm.
one thing I've studied quite a bit, as I think, is mediumship.
Mm.
And I've come across a lot of mediums, and I've looked into a lot of mediums, even the greats like Alice Bailey and so on. And I've come to the conclusion that nobody at all practiced mediumship in the way that he did, which was a Kundalini form, as it were, of mediumship. I honestly don't believe most mediums, including me, know where the Kundalini is exactly while they're channeling or work, being a medium. But that was a prerequisite, but that's just one illustration. So it was those early years that enabled him to bring that kind of control, and he wasn't distracted by the things that men all of us really, men and women, in their early life are looking for,
He was completely celibate,
a
no?
partner, yeah,
Yeah.
a family, maybe, parties, a successful career. Nothing. He was only focused on finding out the truth as he saw it, which you could only find through realization.
Okay, so he did this deep meditation, but to get to that, he still had to, because a lot of mediums, like I said, they have superb powers, but they gifted it. They don't do exercises to develop it even further. They stay at that level, they plateau. So,
Yeah.
but he could already do seances and things like that. So then he did these intensive practices. So what kind of things would he do sitting in his room at
So
home?
he would be doing, and by the way, in his book, from his point of view, mediums who don't do practices cannot be relied on. That's him speaking, not me. Doesn't mean that they won't sometimes get good things. They might,
Right.
can happen, but they can also influence it. They won't have the control and the degree of concentration necessary to sustain it, and their own mind will creep in unwittingly, not deliberately. They're well intended. He thought it was a requirement, actually, to have yoga or some form of equivalent training to be a medium, but that's diverting a bit. Yeah, he was doing a lot of pranayama, which is breathing exercises. This was absolutely key to him. He was doing a lot of mantra yoga. That's one of his specialities. And he would discover the sounds to him. And he had a view of mantra, which again, I haven't come across put so simply anywhere else. Maybe it has been, but I haven't come across it, which is that mantra is an invocation of sound
Okay.
more than words.
Sound
And it's the
vibrations.
sound vibrations, and it's the effect that sound has on the ethers. So, the words and the meaning of the words, and the words in a mantra do have meanings, don't really get close to the real meaning. The real meaning can only be discovered when when it's chanted in the right way with the right sound.
So what does these vibrations have an effect on the body?
Well, the various things. First of all, you can use mantra to help others, and we do that in the Aetherius Society a lot in sending out healing, because you can draw to yourself spiritual power, which you can then channel through you and out, either for the world to help sufferers from COVID, or, for example, recently we were doing a lot with the Lebanon crisis. It's a form of prayer, you might say, when it's used like that.
No, these are Sanskrit mantras, we should say.
These are Sanskrit mantras.
It's a special vibrational sound.
It's the vibration. And why the sound is so important was he would settle with those mantras on how a particular mantra should be chanted to get the correct sound, to have the right interaction. It's almost abstract at that point. It's no longer about what the word means at all, as a word.
Because this is like
sound. Yeah.
You can break a glass with the vibration. You can start an avalanche. But
exactly.
These sounds are even more special because they relate to our chakras and
it'd be something you'd relate to with music as well. But yes, they would relate to chakras. And also, of course, certain mantras are done silently. There's more than one way of doing them silently. And he would do that. It depends what level you want to have an effect on. So he would say, if you're doing a mantra aloud, you're having an effect on the physical environment. If you're doing it in certain other ways, you might have, and silently, you might have an effect on the mental or the psychic or the spiritual environment and your internal environment.
Right.
I know when I developed psychic abilities, and when I started to do that, that was one of the main things that I did. Which was silent mantra. And that can have quite an effect on you internally.
So the
key thing is control. I should just quickly say that it's not just activating powers, it's using them in the right way for others and controlling them.
And so you have to still the mind completely. You're just focusing on the mantra.
Absolutely. I mean, concentration to him is step one. He had a 3-step path, and it's outlined also in the 9 Freedoms. The 9 Freedoms is a text delivered by an intelligence who has a code name or a pseudonym, which is Mars Sector 6. And it's outstanding. And then he comments on it. In my opinion, sometimes the commentary by Dr. King is more advanced in a way than the text itself.
Right.
That's my view. In other words, and we're talking, as I said earlier, about sort of 1962. His standards were so high that he immediately takes it in his commentary off to a very high level indeed. And the text sometimes doesn't have to be read in such a rigorous way. And I think that is because of his innate advancement. And that's partly because of those 10 years where he did that, which I haven't found, actually, Jack, anybody else in the West who's even claimed to have done that. So, it's a one-off. And to do it when you're between 25 and 35, you're kind of really vigorous, you're fit. You devote your energy not to material things, not to relationships, not to, okay, his mother was alive and he saw her and father, but he wasn't a massive family person. He was fine. He had a sister, but he focused his energies internally on Raja Yoga, which is control of the mind and control of your psychic powers and abilities. Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga to some degree through the mantra, which is devotional. But I would say that Raja Yoga and Jnana Yoga were his 2 favorite yogas. And then he threw himself later into Kundalini Yoga. But he didn't recommend people to do that because it could be quite dangerous.
He mentioned
the way he did it.
He mentioned that because he wasn't the only person, obviously he wasn't the only person in London doing it at that time, because he says that one of his friends was in a wheelchair afterwards.
Yeah. I've met people, I don't know whether it's true. I met a gentleman at the Theosophical Society, who's quite a bit older than me, if you can imagine that at all. And he said that, he did it and he couldn't walk for a while. And if you're doing those, because some of those sorts of exercises are physical, that they're physical ways of forcing Kundalini up the spine. And they use, they use vigorous types of breathing and physical internal pressures.
So lots
to do
like
it.
banders and
Yeah, I mean, they're around. I mean, they're out there now. I mean, and there are some Kriya yoga exercises that are out there that probably shouldn't be out there, but they are. And I would just give a warning with that. You can raise the Kundalini. I mean, there's a methodology, for example, in the book Realize Your Inner Potential, which I was honored to co-author, but it's his book and the practices that he knew and used. And there is a Kundalini visualization there, but it's based on visualization. It's not based on force. And even then, one needs to take certain precautions in doing it. And he was very careful. That's the only exercise actually in that book that he hesitated to put in at all. But it isn't a physical Kundalini yoga exercise where you're physically trying to force that, because the danger, Jack, it would be that you would succeed and you wouldn't be able to get it back down again.
Right.
I think, sorry.
You have to have a lot of concentration.
You do. I mean, I must say, the people that I have met, and I've met teachers and people who say they're students, I've never found them to be doing what I would regard as proper Kundalini yoga. They call it that, and it isn't that to me. And so if you're doing that kind of so-called Kundalini yoga, you'll be quite safe, because it isn't going to work. Okay. The danger is when you actually come across a
good teacher.
Yeah, a good teacher probably wouldn't, they wouldn't give it to you unless you're under their tutelage and in their personal presence.
Because you have to be able to concentrate on a fish scale or a postage stamp for 8 hours without getting up and going to the toilet or thinking of another thing.
Yeah. Well, if you can do that, and who can do that? I mean, but if you can, you're way on the way. I mean, because it brings us back to the mediumship thing, actually, because if you've got a good grounding in concentration, and I personally wouldn't recommend a postage stamp or fish scales, I would say do a mantra if you know one, or do the 12 blessings, or do some prayer, or concentrate on a positive affirmation. You might as well, if you're going to put your time into it, concentrate on something that's useful and productive. But to have that fixity is extremely rare. And so when you start to get elevated experience, even in my limited experience, when I've started to get higher intelligences, and I'm trying to be able to receive communications from them, there is an instinctive, some yogas would call it sattvic. It's a sense of peace and bliss that can envelop you, and it's very nice, but it can make your concentration wander, and you can just relax into it. If you're not careful, stop concentrating, and that's when some mistakes can creep in, strangely enough. It's sort of, so it's trying to stay focused. And in his case, he was overshadowed, just to name one, the Master Jesus. And he doesn't get, I mean, the very essence of that being is beautiful. And can you imagine being overshadowed by such an intelligence? And to remain, that's where you need your grounding, your concentration, and he had it because of all those years of training. Yeah.
So because also when I'm doing mantra or deep breathing, you get to deep thinking, because
yes,
when you're just sitting there meditating, you turn the brain off. But when you're doing these exercises, you're actually getting better ideas. So you grab onto them and I will do this and I'll do that. So it's
a strange thing there. You're right. I agree. And it's a strange thing that, because you mentioned, sort of meditation, you sort of turn your brain off and so on. And that's how it's in mindfulness and so on. And it can be good for your health.
Yeah.
But it's not meditation in the way that Dr. King saw it at all. Meditation, it might be a way of sort of stilling the mind and feeling calm and dealing with stress. And I've taught it myself at times, but it's not the meditation that Dr. King spoke of. Meditation that he spoke of came right down the line. So you have this intense concentration. When you've developed that, he would say, then you can start to go to the next stage, which is contemplation. And the next stage beyond that, to Dr. King, was meditation. Now, in that way, he was stricter than, for example, Swami Sivananda. And Swami Sivananda was really strict. But, he was dharana, dhyana, samadhi. And it's the dhyana, if I pronounce that right, stage, the second stage, of which they refer to as meditation very often. But to Dr. King, the only true meditation was samadhi. I must say, though, as I said earlier, he did sort of compromise on that more as he got older. And I do remember, for example, when I was in Los Angeles, he would send some of us into the temple to meditate on this or that. And he wasn't expecting us all to raise a kundalini to the right sense. So he did change. But in those early days, he was no nonsense. And I think that's because he really thought what he'd done others could do. It was probably a shock to him when he found, well, actually, it is extremely unusual, and he is really unusual.
So most people today, the most popular, 99% of people are doing a meditation, which is not meditation, as we just said. They're having a concentration practice, so they're concentrating on their breath, or they're watching one of these, listening to one of these meditation tapes, which is just concentrating and trying to still the mind. And everyone's focused on this stilling the mind. So, but what Dr. King did is he increased the voltage with these practices.
He did, and he had a different, what comes down to it was his motivation. Because a lot of people now are turning to meditation and mindfulness and yoga as a sort of adjunct to improve their life. And that really means their material life, their emotional life, even possibly their career life.
So they can function better.
Some businesses are So their goal isn't a truly spiritual goal necessarily. Doesn't mean it's bad. It might be good, it might not, but it's not the same goal. It's not. Whereas to him, yoga, the meaning of the word yoga was union with God, union with Brahma, if you like, union with that, and that's what he was seeking. To contact his higher self through yoga. And he called I think it was his first book, Contact Your Higher Self Through Yoga. That was a reflection of those years that he'd been. Those are practices in that book that he didn't invent. He modified them from what he'd been taught, made them safer than what he'd been taught, and added, I think brilliantly added aspects such as affirmations to them, so they work, and then people could use them safely. But he never saw, to him, yoga, if you'd said to him, well, yoga's a good thing to help you with, a stressful day at the work. No, that wasn't how he looked at it.
No.
Or to tone up your body so you'll be more attractive or even healthier, which is, I'm not saying that's bad, but it's not the aim. And that's not why it was devised. And all the yogas would say that, by the way. Sivananda, Yogananda, Vivekananda, I love them all. And they'd all say it. Sivananda's uncompromising. It wasn't about that, but it's become. So it's partly a good thing and partly not, I suppose, the way it's gone. It's a good thing. More people know about it. More people use it. But it's also been, I don't want to say debased because that would be wrong, but it's been brought down. People don't realize that they've lost track. They possibly don't even know about the elevated aspects of it. So it's what it's really there for. Sorry.
Sure. So if someone was doing an hour meditation and the return on investment compared to the practices Dr. King did are very minimal compared to if you just sit there and.
Well, look, I certainly don't want to sound discouraging. So don't get me wrong. I'm sure there's a lot of people doing these practices who are on a spiritual quest, and that's great. And it can work. And if you did an hour a day, it would be, I think, fantastic. I think it would be very rewarding. As you know, our focus now in the Aetherius Society is primarily service. That's what we believe in. That's the greatest yoga to us of all of them. And Dr. King said that. It's
Right.
greater than Raja Yoga. It's greater than Jnana Yoga. But he also said that the other things can help you in your service, and they'll help you with your motivation too, because it's quite a difficult thing to be motivated in this world with all the subliminal messages that are coming at us from all over the place in the world by a spiritual force or a desire to serve humanity or desire to serve others. And so doing those practices will help. I think it's essential. I mean, I do breathing exercises every day, and a lot of people I know do, and I find it necessary for myself. But it's not my sort of goal, but it's a wonderful thing. I look forward to it. And some people say, well, I'm so busy, I'm rushed, I'm here, I'm there. But you're not. I mean, you do your teeth, you have breakfast, you can do it. But I wouldn't say that an hour a day is it, and it very much depends what that hour is composed of. What I would suggest to people who perhaps listening to this, who are spending an hour a day in yoga, is to break up that hour, and it can still be yoga, so that some of it is service orientated. Some of it is sending healing to others. For example, in this pandemic, whatever you believe the pandemic is or isn't, certainly people need healing. And that, or to send it for the betterment of the world, or if you like, for animals, or whatever you decide, you can send energy out. I think if you try that, I've certainly tested this, it will improve your development as well. The other half that you spend on your own development will be better than if you're doing it all for yourself.
Well, Dr. King was very big on that. He was just really studying out. He used to, his friends, he would tell them off for spending hours meditating, saying you can send out energy through your palm of your hand and your heart chakra into a hospital instead of just sitting there trying to refine your own mind.
Yeah, it's very hot on it. And he used to tell the story of the person, who walked on water. I think MacDonald Bain was a mystic, I think from South Africa, who traveled in India. We're cutting the long story short. He was taken there by his own teacher, who I think was Tibetan, I believe. And they came across one of these yogis who developed the ability to walk on water, which isn't, unknown. I mean, Jesus practiced it, but it was practiced by certain yogis. And it took him 10 years. The teacher asked him, so how long did it take you to learn that ability? He said, 10 years. And he could demonstrate it. And the yogi said to him, and you've saved yourself 1 penny on the ferry. He said, get back, give healing, teach. Yeah. And apparently this yogi did. He listened, he thanked him, he changed immediately. And next time he was seen was in the marketplace, healing, teaching. He'd lost that.
Who said it to him? Who was in?
So MacDonald Bain was the writer. This is I don't know. I'm guessing it might be the 1930s or 40s. I'm not sure. Something like that. The story Dr. King used to tell.
Okay.
And he went to meet his own teacher. I remember it well because MacDonald Bain had written a lot of books, sort of metaphysical books. And I knew a lady who was a member of the society who knew him. And he was quite a well-known mystic, really. And he went over, he was guided by a Tibetan, I think he was Tibetan, certainly Himalayan. And he went over to meet him for the first time, physically meet him. He'd had communication.
Okay, projections.
And I think just telepathic communication, I don't know if he'd projected there before. But anyway, he went to meet him. He did meet him. And he was quite nervous. And his first words to his teacher was something like, well, I've written a lot of books on so and so and so and so. And the teacher apparently looked at him and said, well, that doesn't really matter, does it? And he stopped and he said, no, I suppose it doesn't. And from then he learned from him. And in their travels, they met the yogi who walked on water.
Gosh. Yeah, I know you studied a lot. You read a lot of autobiography of the yogi and those stories.
Oh, yeah. I'm totally into, I love that. I love it all. I'm a round peg in a round hole on that kind of a topic. And I was quite fortunate, actually, to be able to talk sometimes to I call him the master, but to Dr. King about such topics, which wasn't that common because if you look at it from Dr. King's point of view, if you had a spiritual or metaphysical conversation with him, it ended up as a lecture by him. So it wasn't like a two-way, exchange of views. He didn't really need my views or many people's views. So I was quite fortunate, because a lot of people I knew said, gosh, I wish I'd had. I mean, I'll give you one example, if you like. I was in Santa Barbara, where he lived, and this was the latter part of his life. So it'd be the 1990s. He wasn't in the best of health. And I went over there, and I was into a book at the time called, because one thing in the Aetherius Society, we don't say, look, the Aetherius Society books are the only books you should read, or to me, they're the greatest by far, to me. But I also read many other interesting. I was looking at the Ramayana today, actually, briefly. There's a lot of interesting things out there. And there's one book called Nature's Finer Forces, which he recommends in the 9 Freedoms, actually. And in it is a practice, which actually Sivananda refers to as well, called the shadow practice. Okay. The only trouble with that practice is that you do need a sunny day to do it.
It's watching the shadows.
It's watching the shadow. You know it. You know.
I've heard you mention this.
Oh, okay. So I was doing this in his garden, and every day he'd be given healing by 2 or 3, whoever it might be. It might be, if I was fortunate enough to be called, I'd be one, or it might be 1 or 2 others. And then he'd go for a rest in the afternoon. He called it a rest, but in that all sorts of things could happen. He could project, he could whatever. So you didn't disturb him. And it usually lasted, it could be half an hour, wouldn't be less, it could be longer. So we'd put him to bed, as we put it. I was there, it was like 2 or 2:30 in the afternoon. Sun was there, perfect. I walked round the side of his little bungalow there, and I was doing the shadow practice, through which you can know the 3 times. You have to do a certain mantra 108 times, and so on. Within 1 or 2 minutes, he got up, walked out, walked round, looked at me standing there, and said, "That's it, boy, keep watching the shadows." Walked away, went back to his rest. I hadn't told him. I even knew this book. I had it. I told him nothing about it at all. So later that evening, I was having a drink and a chat with him on his little deck in his garden before dinner. So I thought, well, I'll tell him this. I'll tell him this, what I was doing. I said, I was doing this, and you came out, you said this, and it was exactly what I was doing. And he didn't bat an eyelid. He didn't say, yes, I know, or really, or he just listened. And then he started talking about this book.
Okay.
And he referred to the years you're talking about. And he said, there was a time when I first came across that book, when I wanted to devote my whole life to it, to live it. Because it's not the whole book, actually. It's a Sanskrit text inside that book. And it does tell you how to, lead your life fully. It's very much a sort of yogic Bible of itself. And through it, you can fully realize yourself. He said, but I realized to live that book, I'd have to either be a millionaire, and this was there in those days, so I could just do that, because it's very prescriptive. Tuesday morning, you have to do that. Wednesday, at this time, you do this, and it's you have to follow it exactly. Or he said, I'd have to just drop out and become virtually a tramp, and I wasn't going to do that. And he talked, and on we went, talked about many things, and on it was going. And then somebody was cooking dinner and came out and asked the question, or said, well, dinner's ready, or words to that effect. And he just looked at me and said, what's food, really, And so the person, because we're in the middle of this really elevated conversation, it certainly wasn't the fault of the cook at all, not at all. In fact, on the contrary, he then, realized this was not really fair. So he went in, and then he made a point of telling me off. So you distracted me. Look at the hard work this person's been cooking away. And that was fine by me. I said, sorry, my mistake. But it just I could see there how it had been for him, where he wasn't interested in anything other than that focus on that path that he'd been on in those days.
Because I'm sure he would have loved to. He said he didn't want to be his brother's keeper. I mean, it really was to have to be responsible for humanity is a lot on your shoulders. I mean, you'd love to take
Yeah,
it a few.
that's true. I mean, he's very honest about that. When he first heard, when he first realized that service was what he had to do, he didn't. It was like slightly disappointing to him in a way. That wasn't what he really wanted, but boy, did he says that. But at the same time, even in those years, there are so many accounts that he gives of where he helped a person through exorcism, through healing, through
Mm,
mediumship. He was focused even prior to his contacts in the Aetherius Society. He was focused on building up a healing circle.
I'm right. Yeah.
So he really was orientated to service, actually. But he was also drawn in those years because he was on the quest for full enlightenment, and he found it. I mean, he gained cosmic consciousness, which is as high as it gets. I don't know what year he gained it, but those years were critical, in paving the way for him to do that.
It's probably important to realize that an hour when he started practicing that 10 years is not equivalent to, is equivalent to 10 minutes later or whatever in the back. He accelerated. So what would have taken him,
That's true.
a day to do in the first year, he might be able to do it in 10 minutes after 5 years. So he's accelerating all the time.
Yes, and when he entered samadhi, in order to take a transmission, sometimes he'd be given just 1 or 2 minutes notice. I mean, he had to sit down and do it very quickly. Once he was reprimanded, actually, one occasion by Saint Guling for forcing it too much. Saint Guling being an ascended master of this earth, because it's not good for him to do that for his own well-being. But he could do it, as you're absolutely right. And the other thing I would also throw in here is that experience can't be measured in time. I know that may sound like a platitude, but it's really important. I mean, you can have like 7 minutes. I mean, there's something that you know about and I know about, which is, and I don't want to divert from your topic, but it's known as the initiation of Earth. And people who are interested can look into that. But that actual initiation, I believe the time that it actually took to do was 7 minutes, the actual time when energy was being poured into Earth. The reason I mention that is because those 7 minutes were more valuable in experience terms in the history of this Earth than possibly hundreds, thousands, or even millions of years. And that principle applies in yoga. You can have an elevated experience which can take place, in a relatively short amount of time on the clock, but it's 1,000 years of experience if you get it right, and that's a big if. But if you really get it right, yeah.
Because he was advanced. I mean, he would be advancing all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
like I mean, you mentioned that meditation he did in Cornwall. Was it
65 hours. Yeah.
and he held his breath. There was no breathing in that time.
I'm not saying that. I haven't heard that there was no breathing in that time. It's possible, or I might have missed it, but it's possible. Certainly, he could hold his breath, and he did hold his breath for long periods. Yes, he did.
So in the beginning, he would, he's doing all these pranayama breath holds. It's all about increasing the prana in the body. Yeah. So
Yeah, and excuse me, he would use various forms of breathing exercise to draw energy in. But his main focus, I mean, he honed in on Kundalini in a way that I find quite unusual. It's not unique. I mean, there are other masters who've honed in on Kundalini, that's for sure. But he saw that. He was a very scientific person. So he could see that, the journey of the individual as being measured in the journey of the Kundalini within and through the chakras to the highest chakra. And that, as far as he was concerned, is the only reason that we on Earth are here, to master and control that force. You don't actually need to do Kundalini yoga to do that. I would even say this, you don't have to have even heard of Kundalini to be harnessing it, using it, and raising it. I mean, there are people in the West who hadn't heard of Kundalini in that particular life, and one would be Wordsworth, who clearly were having experiences that were Kundalini experiences and breathlessness and all kinds of things, but they didn't have, as we would now, the reference to Eastern teaching to draw on. They were just doing it. Maybe they'd done it in a former life. Maybe you can have a realization at any given moment, but you just might not know it's Kundalini.
Right. So because cosmic consciousness of actually
It's universal.
people.
It's
Yeah.
yeah.
It can just happen spontaneously, and you realize the oneness of everything. Or just, I mean, talking about incredible experiences like that. You can't put it.
Cosmic consciousness is, sort of something that's bandied about quite a lot, and doesn't mean it isn't great. I mean, Yogananda had a cosmic consciousness experience, which I think is clearly different, and I believe Yogananda would be the first to say this, from the one that Dr. King described. It's still a great experience, though, very elevated. It was actually induced by his own guru. So there are all kinds of degrees and levels of these things. Dr. King himself mastered it. He sort of got it down to an absolute. He could almost like switch it on and off, and he was intrigued by the science of it, I think, as well. He actually did say you don't have to take that approach to it,
Right?
but I think he thought you gain more if you did. I'm sure he thought that. Yeah.
But it's not recommended. But we should still do practices like King Yoga.
We should do practices. Yeah, I mean, King Yoga. I mean, in the book, Realize You're in the Potential. I think those exercises in there, and I don't say this because I'm an author, because I want to repeat that this book was, it's Dr. King's book. I was just very lucky to be asked by him to write it with him. The exercises, and there's over 40 of them, there's 42 of them, I believe, are absolutely superb. I mean, they are just fantastic. They are, some of them are ancient yoga practices, some are new age teachings that have been delivered through Dr. King, some are his own inventions or devices, based on his wisdom and his knowledge, and they really, really work. And I had some very interesting experiences while writing that book. I mean, I'll give you one example, which again tells you something about Dr. King. I was introduced to a mantra which is called the Brahma mantra, but it's not in that book. But I was introduced to it by a friend of mine who'd got hold of a very old Sanskrit book, and he had a whole collection. This friend, he's in the Aetherius. He's passed on now. I'm sure he still is in the Aetherius Society, but and he showed me that mantra in the book, and I started practicing it. And I had a dream some while later in which Dr. King told me of. I was in England at the time. He was in America at the time when I had the dream, because I was flying to and fro a lot in that period and speaking to him, as I said, every day. And in the dream, he told me off. He said, you should not have done this mantra, the mantra, without my permission. So I woke up and I stopped doing it. And then I was in America, and we were working on Realize You're in a Potential together and going through which mantras were in the book. And in the course of it, he mentioned the Brahma mantra. So that was my opportunity. So once again, I told him about it. I didn't tell him, friend. I didn't want to get the chap into trouble who'd given me this mantra, because it shows how strict he was on mantra. It has to be conveyed by initiation,
right,
by someone within whom that mantra lives, or it's unfortunate, both for the person who gives it and the person who receives it. So he said, I told him the whole story, and I said, I had this dream. You told me off in the dream. I haven't used it since. Again, he didn't bat an eyelid. He didn't say, yes, I know. No, I don't. Really? Nothing like that. It was just looked at me quite still. And I knew him very well, don't forget, by then. He said, say it now. So I said, it's quite a long mantra if you do the whole thing. I said the whole thing as best I could. And he corrected me on the pronunciation of one word. And that word, that syllable, actually, you wouldn't really pronounce the way he did it if you just read it. And this bears on the point I said earlier about the sound of the mantra. And so then I said it again in the way he told me, and he just nodded. And I took it from that I had, so I use it now. But it's an interesting little insight into his strictness about mantra. I was actually surprised he put 5 mantras in that book. Brian Kniep, who was helping, and I asked for 2 mantras to go in that book, because you'd normally give them. We knew his approach to mantra, which is a brilliant approach, actually, and an ancient approach. That somebody must you can only convey an advanced teaching if you know it yourself, at least to a certain level.
Because there are a lot
Otherwise, you can't.
There's karmic implications.
There's a karmic implication, and you might be the best orator in the world, and there's plenty of people giving out mantras who don't live within them, and they don't understand or appreciate this law at all, which actually proves it's not living within them, actually. And or maybe there may be certain cases where they just break that. I don't know, but they're giving it out, and they shouldn't be. And if it lives within you, though, you might not be a very good communicator, but it lives within you. The essence of the teaching is carried. I mean, the ancient Tibetans knew that, for example. They weren't looking for like someone who's qualified teacher, who's the best speaker, who's the best. They were looking for the person who's demonstrated that lesson in their life. That's the person who can we know that. I mean, if you think about painting, I'm not an artist, my wife is, but if you had the choice, if you wanted to learn painting and you told, well, look, there's this fantastic scholar at University London who he knows the history of art backwards and sideways, and he can tell you everything you want to know about the brush and everything, the pastels and you name it. Or Rembrandt. You can go to Rembrandt, who was apparently very short-tempered, very difficult, not very helpful to some of his students. They say, who would you choose? Rembrandt. Why? Because he knows he's demonstrated a genius.
Yeah.
And that's the principle, I think.
But it might be hard for people to understand, because mantra in our current society it's not accepted to the same level as the benefits of meditation. But I've heard that some people who, when a mantra lives within you, if you hear somebody saying it wrongly or badly, it can cause you physical pain. Is that right? Or
it certainly can be unpleasant, and especially if it's said disrespectfully. And that might not be that the person means to say it disrespectfully, but they don't really appreciate what they're doing. And I have come across that. I haven't come across it so much in the Aetherius Society, because we've been taught by Dr. King, and he's very strict on it. But I have been to various festivals and events, and people are perhaps glib, and they're taking it for granted.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know what it's like. If you really venerate, if you revere something that's worth venerating and worth revering, it'll mean much more to you. You'll get much more value from it yourself. And that's certainly true of mantra. The more you respect it, the more you cherish it, the more powerful it will be in your life.
Yeah, I think it must be really hard for somebody to grasp. Like pranayama, you could understand, that if you can hold your breath for 20 minutes, then, the energy is flowing into you. But to understand that you can calibrate your chakras and it has all this powerful effect on your auric structure it's hard. It must be hard to grasp, if you haven't.
It's hard to grasp, but what I would say to people who are finding it hard to grasp is that you can experience it.
Okay.
It might not happen immediately, but if you keep on, you will, in one way or another. It might not be the way you particularly want. It might not be in the way that is, you might be told in a particular Kriya Yoga school that, look, when you're really advanced, you won't need to breathe for 5 minutes, or you might be given these little things. But that might not be the thing you need. You might find that actually doesn't happen, and you think, gosh, I'm not doing very well. But in the meantime, though, you're developing tremendous healing powers, which matters far more. So, it'll come in many different ways. I mean, as I mentioned, I do channeling. I've done it for decades, but I don't suggest particularly that people do that. It's just something that I did, and I still do from time to time. But you don't have to do that. I mean, but for most people, healing, pranayama, mantra, there are many other practices that will be really effective in your life, and it will lead you to where you need to go. It might, I mean, the best thing that can happen is that it makes you more inspired to take to the spiritual path and give you the strength to carry on that path and not be deflected by the many signals and the massive confusion, even in the spiritual world that's out there. By the spiritual world, I mean in the movement, in the sets of teachings that are available and the claims that are made. You know, you have to be able to discriminate, because otherwise they can't all be true, because they contradict each other. So and if you don't know, I mean, you know, somebody might come across the Aetherius Society. I wouldn't expect them to take my word for it or your word for it. They don't have to do that. They just keep an open mind, and they might come across something else that they don't know. But if you keep on, and if you use the practices, sooner or later, you'll know. You'll be able to discriminate. Your intuition will guide you, and your logic will guide you. And you'll say, oh, okay, that's got substance. I mean, that's one of the things I love about Dr. King's teachings, actually, and the teachings that were delivered through him, is that they are, you know, they have tremendous reservoirs of depth. You know, you keep mining and you find, my God, a whole layer of, you know, we've gone through the gold, now we're on to the platinum, or what, you know, whatever it might be. They go on, and you find, I'm discovering things, and I'm thinking, my goodness, why didn't I realize that? I've read that book for, you know, decades, and I've just seen this.
Well,
I've seen what it means now. Sorry.
I read Nature's Finest Forces, and I couldn't find the practice that you mentioned. I did look for it. But...
Okay. It's in the Sanskrit text. I must admit, there's a lot of philosophy. I think it's by Rama Prasad in that book, which can be quite heavy going, maybe.
It's very heavy going.
Okay, thank you. But I don't, to be honest, I'm interested in the concept of tattvas, but I don't really get into that. I go straight. I don't use it now, but I used to go straight to the text, the Sanskrit text on which it's based. I think
it's Sanskrit.
Say again?
You could speak the Sanskrit, or you?
No, it's translated in that book. If you've got a good edition. I mean, I think it's unusual in that I think the Rama Prasad writing comes at the beginning. I think I'm right in saying. Right. And that the actual Sanskrit text on which it's all based possibly comes later. I don't know, but it's in there, and it's not nearly as long as the Rama Prasad commentary, and it is translated. And that's what I go to. That's not by him. It's another document that he found.
Maybe I didn't have that. It's a very complicated. It's a very advanced.
It is. I mean, as Dr. King said, you can't really practice it now. Just to be practical, you couldn't do it all now, but it's still quite revealing. I mean, I must be honest, when I look at those things, and I don't do it so much as I used to, I always come back, though, to pretty well to the 9 freedoms for me, because it goes further than all of them.
And it's for our time. It's for
our time, but it's, you know, in my view, obviously I'm giving my opinion here, for me, it goes further than all of them do. I factor into it that the commentary by Dr. King, although it's very explanatory, it's quite brilliant, it's also fairly advanced. This is one of the things about Dr. King. He was extremely advanced, possibly partly because of those 10 years. He was coming at it from a very advanced place. So when he's talking about bravery, for example, which is the first freedom, he'll give us an example, the stage just prior to samadhi that a person will go through, where they feel very much alone and they're kind of tested at that period. And he gives that as an example. It's not an example that many of us wrestle with, because most people on this earth aren't just at the stage prior to samadhi, but it's there for posterity. And I think it's great that it is. And as I mentioned, when he's talking about enlightenment, he goes in the commentary straight into advanced, what we would call very advanced meditation, samadhi, as being the only real great meditation, which I'm sure is true, but it's not where most people are. And so, having said that, there's some things in it which are extremely simple, easy to understand and follow as well. But he is and was a very advanced teacher, but not too advanced. Not too advanced.
No, well, he had to go through all those things so he could speak to us on our level. If he just would just beam down, he probably wouldn't even be able to. He wouldn't be able to.
No.
He would be have our vocabulary, have our and he's gone now, but he has left us with all these missions which you are carrying out, because when you do these practices with the prayer, or the pranayama, you're holding prana in the body, the mantra, the prana, it's all about this coming into the body, and the chakras, and with the prayer, you have the white light coming down and coming out of your heart and your hands, and you put it into the batteries, which are released at times like this. So it's
actually it is all connected. And what you're talking about, their Operation Prayer Power, which I know you've done yourself, is a brilliant concept. And in some ways, this pandemic has proved its brilliance, I think, more than ever, because the concept being that we store spiritual energy and can release it at a time of our choosing. Now, the idea there was that if there's a catastrophe, such as we did our most recent discharge, which was done from Los Angeles, actually, of Operation Prayer Power Energy, was for the Lebanon catastrophe, which that shows you don't have to be an evil terrorist. You can be a lazy, negligent person and be just as dangerous. That was a tenth, I believe, of the power of Hiroshima, that explosion. Well, we did, and that was just through mismanagement, selfishness. It wasn't somebody setting out to do it. They didn't want to do it, but it happened. There's a big lesson there, I think, for all of us. But point is, prayer power energy was used. But in this whole COVID, pandemic lockdown situation, we haven't been able until quite recently to carry on doing Operation Prayer Power, to charge that battery up, to store energy. But even while we haven't been able to do that, because we've been storing it over the years and the months, we had a reserve. Mm-hmm. And so we have been able to release energy. So that's why I say in some ways its brilliance as a concept has been proved as never before.
No, it's fair. I mean, it must be hard to believe for people new to this, who are not psychic, or who have not.
Yes.
That you can store something like this and it exists. But yeah, I mean, you're doing all these operations. You've proved it many times, many success stories, and
we have, and people can find some of them details. The other book I did with Dr. King was called Contacts, or he did with me, I should say, was Contacts with the Gods from Space, and we give examples in there of some of the results of Operation Prayer Power. But I think it also comes back to the value of the practices, because what the spiritual practices do is they attune you. And so you're able to discriminate. You take your consciousness to a higher level. These things they sound unbelievable because they're different. And they are not sort of in the general parlance of materialism.
So even physics, advanced physics, or yes.
Yeah, it sounds, the skeptical mind kicks in. And, the point is they may be true. They may not be true as far as people. I mean, I have my own experiences. I know they're true, but, I don't expect people to take my word for that. But if you do the practices, though, the spiritual practices, you will stay on a level where you'll be able to sort out what is true and what is not true. I think that could be the most valuable thing the practices can do for you, far more valuable than being able to hold your breath or say, I've got the Kundalini to X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. If you're able to discriminate, is this Operation Prep okay? It sounds unbelievable to me, but I can't say that it's untrue either, if I'm honest. How do I know? Yes, you can examine it. You can read Contacts with Gods from Space. You can look at it. You can come along. You can see if you feel the energy when you're there. Lots of people
can't put their hands down. They can't.
No. Oh yeah. No, you can feel all that. But you'll also be guided to your intuition as well. And this will lead you right. I mean, intuition is never wrong. It's never wrong. We can be wrong. We can be wrong in not listening to it, and we can get it wrong because our imagination kicks in. But if you have the concentration, which comes from the practices, and you're open to the higher, the higher energies from the higher chakras, you'll be able to discriminate, and you can do it with the Aetherius Society. It's not faith. We're not asking anyone to just have faith, although faith in life is very important, but you can judge it for yourself. And if you don't know, say, I don't know. Some people find that difficult. They can't just say, I really don't know. They have to say either I believe it or I don't. A wise person, I do a lot of broadcast on one today, as you know, on UFOs. And I think anyone who comes on with the idea, well, this is a load of nonsense, and there are less and less people who do that, by the way, now, is pretty foolish person, because they don't know. They have no idea. They can't say that they don't exist.
But how is
They
it
can say they don't know.
How is it for you? Because you're promoting, you're a UFO expert, but you're also coming with a religious aspect. There is a higher power, so you can find people who believe in one or the other, but to get someone who's accepting of both, I mean, that's when you look at it logically, I mean, it should they are higher powers. They're up.
And they can travel through invisibility and reappear again. And there are thousands of witnesses who've seen that, including in Sussex recently, over here in England. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been at it for so long doing this, and I remember a time where you were ridiculed. I remember a time where you were called Actually, when I first used to talk about UFOs back in the sort of early 80s, for example, and I brought documents over from the CIA in America and elsewhere, and in Russia later on as well. People would say that if you say the government is lying, which they were lying, because in those days they bothered to lie about it. Now they don't. Now they've just given up. They've absolutely given up. As of this year, they've come out and said, we have no opinions. We're out of this. But in the old days, they would come up with a lot of rubbish. Let's use a polite word. And I would say, well, governments are lying to you. And people would say, well, you're a bit of a nutter to talk about conspiracy theories and to talk about governments lying. Boy, have things changed. Now, if you said governments tell the truth, they think you're a nutter. So things have turned a lot. The UFO movement as a whole now accepts, I think, the spiritual aspect, which it didn't used to do. It used to try and keep the spirit people.
You think it's accepted? No.
Right. I think a lot of them, I don't say all of them have, but no, they don't necessarily believe it, but they accept that spirituality is a part of what they call ufology.
Okay.
And it always has been. If you go back to the early contacts, the very early claimants like Adamski, there was a spiritual aspect there, or I think a theosophical aspect there. It's a thread that's always been there. And then, of course, particularly when you go back to Ezekiel, and then you go to the Ramayana, and
clouds in the
these
sky.
Spiritual books, they've been connected. I mean, Moses, traveled in a cloud. Jesus traveled in a cloud.
The Bible is a UFO book. No, I mean
it is, among other things. Yeah, so you can't take. I think a lot of people realize that, even if they don't like it, they kind of realize it. So I think it has improved in that respect.
But so how do you? Because I'm trying to promote this society in my way.
Yeah, well done, well done.
But I don't have your the way you've so articulate the way you explain it. How do you?
Oh no, you don't have to. Look, I'm sure you're doing it great.
How do you persuade people for the first time? How do you start? Because there's many different aspects. You could say this is a yoga training, or your advanced yoga religion, or it's a UFOs, or it's
I've decided, and I talk a lot to Brian Kniep about this, who's the secretary in America, that there isn't one way to discover the Aetherius Society. There are many ways. People come to the Aetherius Society through sometimes UFOs. People might.
How do people join?
We have had people join as a result of UFOs. I think healing has brought a number of people.
Because people come from Kundalini, Reiki. There's like a.
Not really. Well, they might do Reiki, but they come to us through the King technique, through the technique in the magic of healing, or in You Too Can Heal. And sometimes they've been patients and they've been healed by it, and then they get interested. Some people have come through yoga and spiritual philosophy. Some people have come through psychic development, and now moved, beyond that. There's a whole variety of ways. There isn't one way. One thing I don't try and do, because you used the word there, which was persuade, and I'm not saying I've never tried to do that. Probably I probably was when I first started, but I don't try and persuade anybody now. I don't think it. Well, even if it worked, it wouldn't last. They have to find it themselves, and so I'm not trying to convert anybody. I'm trying to share. I think that's a good policy to have in your mind if they want to, and if they don't want to hear about it, I don't force it on anyone. And I try to take it as far as I can. In my position, that I get sort of invited on some certain radio shows. There'll be a particular topic that it's about, but I'll always try and take it further. I mean, ended up on talk radio with a chap who's actually a friend of mine, James Whale. And, we started out on UFOs. We ended up, including him and another co-presenter called Ash, sending healing energy out to the world in the studio. So you never quite know where it will end up. It's up to people to make their own choices. They'll investigate in their own, in their own way, at their own pace. And I just don't think there's one way in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the way I've come to it is from maybe the academic's the wrong word, but looking at the teachings, not having any special experiences or never seen a UFO, felt this fun.
That's good.
But, the old teachings and how these new ones fit with them perfectly.
Yes.
And, it's just.
I think that's an excellent way in.
Because I'm volunteering I volunteer with the society to proofread the transcripts of the, of Dr. King and it's just this huge volume of.
It's incredible. It's just incredible.
And I can't. That's not something I can tell to someone in a bar in 10 minutes. They've got to spend,
of course,
100 hours reading this to just to understand that if it is made.
Well, I'll tell you a yoga story then, which is in the autobiography of a yoga by someone I rightly or wrongly regard as a very good friend, namely Paramahansa Yogananda. And he tells the story of someone who was seeking truth, and he found a guru to teach him. And he went up to the guru and said, will you become my guru? Can I learn from you? And the guru grabbed him and dipped his head in a sort of basin of water, or I don't know, with a basin or something, or anyway, a container of water, until he could hardly breathe, and then pulled him out. He was quite worried, this student. He said, when you're there, what did you want most when I had your head in the water? And he said, air, master. He said, when you can say truth, I'll teach you. Now go. And I love those stories. And there's some stories that are even more stronger than that one in that book.
Lucky Dr. King was never.
He was strict. Anyone who was close to him would say that. But he was extremely generous and very compassionate. But I'm sure, though, that's only half the story. I don't know, but I'm sure that guru did more for that student than he seemed to do. That's what they would do. And then, one hopes the student might go away, learn the lesson, and then come back and then say, now I'm ready. I want truth. But why I mention that is because the person has to be searching themselves. You might meet them for 10 minutes in a bar. You might tell them some fantastic knowledge, but you won't turn them into a searcher. Only their own experience can do that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, to anyone listening, I mean, there's just, the books you've written and the book Dr. Gates, even just that is only the tip of the pyramid from us helps. If there's just this mountain of knowledge there, and
there is.
Just to go through what you've written is just to skim it's fantastic, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. So.
It is a tip of the iceberg. And Dr. King himself believed, and I'm sure he was right, that although we're extremely open, I mean, read the Dhammapada, read the Bhagavad Gita, and he recommended certain things, you don't actually need anything. Let me put it this way. There is easily enough knowledge, practices, and disciplines and procedures within the Aetherius Society for anyone. So although we'll say, yes, there's other things that are interesting, and if you're interested, by all means study them. We're not saying we're the only people. You don't need anything else. I mean, I have to say that I realize that. I might read things out of interest. They might be of interest to me, but there's more than enough teaching, practice. The 12 blessings alone, there's no limit to how much you can do that.
I heard that someone gave me some good advice, is that the first technique you're given is the one you need, and you just use that one. It'll take you to the end. You know, the first mantra you get for the first breathing exercise, just do that. And get that one is good. Anything will take you to the heights.
It would have done. I get the spirit of what you're saying, but I have to say, in this day and age, the karma has changed. That's one of the things that we believe in the society now. And the karma is such now that to get to the heights you're talking about, all the way to the heights, you might get to a certain level.
Yeah,
I could name a teacher who's very well known as a very popular teacher of so-called enlightenment. And I've met him. And he's certainly reached a certain stage, but he hasn't reached enlightenment as defined by Dr. King anyway. So it's quite dangerous when you think you've arrived, as a matter of fact.
I just meant that, if you get...
I understand the principle, but...
Any mantra, is...
Yes, indeed. But what I'm coming to is that in this day and age, you have to serve. It's a strange thing. I heard on the news the other day, actually, about somebody who had a vineyard that was in difficulties. They couldn't pull all the vines because of COVID, and it's quite a long story. So they put something on Facebook, and lots of people came to help them pluck the vines and help them. And in one way, that's great. But then when you stop and think, all those people plucking the vines on that vineyard, if they, what they could have done for people in real distress, children on the street, and so on. And then if you go beyond that to spiritual things, and what I'm leading up to here is the thing that will take us to the heights eventually, the real heights, is to serve in the most effective way that we possibly can. And I've been asked before, but in television interviews, which is better, material service or spiritual service? And the answer I've given is that both are needed. We send energy to Lebanon, but my goodness, it's the people going in there, digging people out of rubble, healing them in makeshift hospitals. I think they're much greater saints than people sitting in caves right now in the Himalayas. And they don't believe in spiritual things, some of them probably. They may not. But what I would say is this: many more people believe in material service, and they will support material service. There aren't many people on this earth who believe in spiritual service. And in the case of the Aetherius Society, cooperating directly with beings from higher worlds. So that then, because not many people are willing to do it, not many people, I would say, are ready to believe it or accept it into their lives, is the most valuable service anyone can give. And that will take you to the heights.
Okay, so that's the way. You're not running a soup kitchen in London or something like that. There's other people doing that.
Those things are great. Helping some people with their vineyard is good. I mean, they're not sitting at home watching telly. They're helping someone. But you've got to serve in the most potent way because I always remember Albert Schweitzer because my mother used to read to me as I was growing up. It's sort of ingrained into me. Here was a man who was a brilliant organist, a great theologian, but he realized he could do more good if he learned medicine, in his case. And not only learned medicine, go out and live in a leper colony, having learned medicine. And that's exactly what he did. And you've got to take your hat off to that. It wasn't his chosen or his, preferred occupation, which was, as I say, music and theology. But he said, this is how I can help. Now, in this day and age, I'm here in the Aetherius Society because I believe that's the most effective way we can help our world.
Right.
And indeed cooperate with higher powers. And indeed, most importantly, actually, help the planet herself as a living being. if I didn't believe that, it'd be different. But people have to make their own judgments. But when you find the way that you can make the biggest difference to the whole, that's going to take you to the heights if you do it.
I've heard it said that the 12 blessings is the most powerful tantric yoga technique ever given in the mystery schools. It's the most powerful technique you can learn.
Right. It's the greatest spiritual practice. I've never heard it described as tantric, as a matter of fact, myself. I've never heard that word used.
I thought tantric means like combining the many yogas. So it's tantra is like that combines. So karma.
I think probably tantra is used in perhaps different ways by different people.
I think so, yeah.
Word.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a yoga practice. And I must give credit there, not only to the Master Jesus, but to Dr. George King. Because you're familiar with the 12 blessings, and you know it's a set of 12 practices, obviously, and they're all blessings. And it takes, as Master Jesus once said, it introduces a cosmic concept, or introduces the cosmic awareness or realization through that text. If it had been just left, though, and I'm sure the Master Jesus would have known that it wouldn't just be left like that, it would have been just a much greater version, if you like, of the Sermon on the Mount, an extension of that. They don't practice the Sermon on the Mount. They read it in church or at home. It's Dr. King who turned it into the practice that we use.
Really?
It's something that I didn't realize that until a couple of years ago. And I remember phoning Brian Kniep up and said, and I made the point, and he hadn't thought about it quite like that. And that's an example, actually, of the humility of Dr. King. He always let it say, the practice. It is a practice brought to earth by the Master Jesus, that's for sure. And, I'm sure the Master Jesus knew, but it was Dr. King who said, raise the hands, visualize the white light. It's not in the text.
Really? Yeah,
it's not in the text delivered by the Master. You've got the book, haven't you? And you've heard it, maybe.
Because it's combined of headline. There's a headline, just the blessing, the light.
Yes.
And then there's a part of what's the second?
Some words. Yeah.
Some words.
Text.
So,
yeah.
And then there's a
prayer.
A prayer. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very true. And it was delivered like that, and it could have stayed like that. And what would we have done with it if Dr. King hadn't said, visualize white light, raise your hands, do the blessing, send it to the group soul, leave a pause, then do the prayer. It's he who made it what it is. And he never, ever claimed that. He never went around saying that. He just did it. And I'm sure the Master Jesus knew he would do it, by the way. But you won't find a transmission from the Master Jesus which says, raise your hands, visualize the white light, going out through the palms, out through that's from Dr. George King.
Because the way it works, the structured is, it starts with the first 6 blessings after the 7th blessing is the Mother Earth.
Yes, it gets more cosmic from the 7th. Yeah,
right.
That's true.
So you send out power to the being with the blessing, and you get power back, and then you send it out to the next level up. And so it's a magic.
And again, all that's been explained by Dr. King. That's all his explanation.
Right.
And there's also some commentary in there by Saint Guling before each one. But essentially, it was turned into this wonderful, wonderful practice. And you're right, it's one of the greatest practices, if not the greatest practice any of us can do in these days. And if you can go to a holy mountain and do it, if you're able to do that, all the better. But the best place to do it, if you can, and most people can't do this because they may not be in a town or a country where they can do it. But if you can do it at the Operation Prayer Power, that's now its greatest use, actually, of all, because then it's working directly with cosmic intelligences who manipulate the energy themselves.
So there's a 12 Blessings website, 12 blessings.
12blessings.org, and we do online services, and people can join in, and hundreds of people do join in. You don't have to be a member. A lot of the people who join in aren't members. Some of them are brand new, and you're guided through it. So yes, 12blessings.org. It's a wonderful practice, and it will benefit the world tremendously. And by sending energy out to the world, we're improving conditions in the world. But it will benefit you as well. And I would say, most importantly of all, it will help the planet. the Mother Earth, because she is waiting for humanity to change. She's holding, I mean, she doesn't have to, but she is. And so the more we can help humanity to change, the better from her point of view. That to me would be the greatest motive of all for doing the 12 blessings.
And it's also there's a 13th blessing because not many people, not even no
Let's
Christians,
call it the 13th, but yeah, the last blessing. Yeah.
not many Christians pray for Jesus to be strengthened.
It's incredible. You know, I've heard, I've actually happened to be driving past an evangelical rally once, and they were singing some kind of a song, which had the words something like this: Jesus, come back to earth. They were calling Jesus to come back to earth. And I thought, you've got it so wrong. I mean, how bad was it the first time? And you want him to come back into this? It's so wrong. And that's where they could learn a bit from the East, actually, and some devotional appreciation.
Sending energy to the.
I mean, we know why, but there's faith, there's reverence, and all of those things. But this last blessing you're talking about, which was actually composed by Dr. King himself, delivered by Dr. King himself, is for the Master Jesus, not asking him to do anything for us, thanking him for the incredible sacrifice he made. And he was on earth for hundreds of years after the resurrection. I mean, he stayed here. He's still here. He's still here now. And if you do the 12 blessings with other people, his presence will be there. And you can feel it. It's the most beautiful. I always think the Master Jesus is such a beautiful intelligence. What we know of him, what we grasp of him, that, and when I say him, by the way, there's no necessity to believe he's any more male than he's female, by the way. He was in a male body to do a job on this earth.
For karmic
reasons. So backward. Well, because we're so backward that if you came as a woman, that it would be very, very difficult to do certain types of job. And I do believe that's one of the reasons a number of avatars have had to be men. I'm not saying they've all had to be men, but he is one in particular who has a lot of the female in him.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And I just think that he's so beautiful that he proves God. I mean, that's such a beautiful, wonderful being. And if you hear his voice, which you can do on the 12 blessings, you can get it on audio form. It's absolutely beautiful. And how can you hear that? This is where I'm coming from and say, no, there's no such thing as God. I've known people to hear that voice and they weren't even told who it was. And they said, that's Jesus. I recognize that somehow.
It's incredible. Yeah. And I've also listened to many of because you have your own podcast,
Aetherius Radio Live.
And you've dissected, you've had an hour on each of the blessing, an hour on each of the freedoms. If you go,
yes, those podcasts. I'm sorry. Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah, we do. Yes,
so you go so deep into each one of those. It's incredible.
Actually, I would say that the lectures that Dr. King delivered on the 12 blessings and especially the 9 freedoms.
I'm listening to them now. I'll check it.
Okay, I mean they are tantamount to transmissions in my book. They're not transmissions per se, they're hints. But some of the things he says there are as great or in the same league as some transmissions that have been delivered, even some aspects of those transmissions. They are truly outstanding and they go, and it proves again how advanced he was and is, the way he could, explain it all.
Just deep, profound occult truths. I mean, you have to study. You can't appreciate them unless you're really you studied metaphysics, and then because it's just very profound, and that's one of the hallmarks of truth, isn't it? That
it is, but he doesn't complicate things, and he tries to keep and did succeed in keeping things very articulate, very easily understood. Avoided using complicated phraseology, so you can understand it at a level. And then as you go through the years, as I said to you earlier, I suddenly read something, oh my goodness, that hits me what that meant now. And I've read it many, many times before. So you don't have to worry about that. You can start in and you'll find you never tire of going back. It's extremely rewarding, and you're sort of unveiling layers upon layers upon layers. One communicator, because the 9 Freedoms was delivered by the Master Jesus, and sorry, the 9 Freedoms was delivered by Mars Sector 6, and the 12 Blessings by the Master Jesus. There is another communicator who doesn't get so much of a mention because he didn't deliver one of those 2 texts, but has delivered possibly more transmissions than any other, and that's the Master Aetherius. And some of his wisdom is very multi-layered. In fact, Dr. King told me that with the Master Aetherius, there's always at least 2 meanings in everything he says. And there could be more than that. And he talks, as I'm sure you know, in a very simple way, a very approachable way. He talks to you as though he's telling you something you always knew. You know, it takes you into his embrace, really. He doesn't talk down or at you. He's very direct. He's not always seeking to be popular. Sometimes he can be generally, he's extremely encouraging, but he can also be disarmingly honest as well. But you do find from his text, I mean, I'll name one, From Free Will to Freedom. In there is a passage which is extremely advanced, I believe, exposition on Kundalini and the chakras. And it's not given in that way. You could read it without realizing that at all. But in fact, it's there, and it's very clear the deeper you go into it. So, you know, unlike, say, some sort of mystical, the old mystics, you know, the sort of from France and England and other parts, they used to write in a very complicated manner whereby you could hardly discern much from even some theosophy at all. With the Aetherius Society teachings, you'll always get something at one level that's very assimilable, very understandable and helpful. But the more you go into it, the deeper it gets, the more is revealed, the more satisfying it is at a very deep soul level.
You must be very, very privileged because, I mean, in 100 years, this will be in academia. There'll be people studying it. You know, now I've heard, you know, you yourself and Alison, your wife, and just one of the few people who are looking at these texts and looking at, you often come up with new insights in your sermons. And,
yes, I mean, I'm mystified, you know, often think, you know, to have been, and I'm not alone, there's a number of us, but to have been that close to someone I regard as one of, if not the, well, I wouldn't compare anyone to Lord Babaji, and nor would Dr. King allow it, and he never claimed this, but I'm saying this, one of the greatest avatars who's ever walked this earth. Or if you want to regard him as a master. And I have to, you know, it's an extraordinary thing, but, you know, I just look upon it, that's what's happened. There must be some reason for it. I'm certainly not deserving as an individual. I'm sort of, it's work in progress. I had a big lesson from him because he phoned me up one day, and this would be in 1987 when I was 33, I think, or 34. Anyway, whatever I was, I should know. I was born in 53. It depends which month it was. Anyway, he phoned me up and he said, I'm thinking of making you a bishop.
mm-hmm.
And what do you think? And I came straight back and I said, well, to be really honest, much as it, you know, be a great honor, I'm really not deserving of this. This is you know, I'm not really worthy of it. And I wasn't trying to be humble. I really meant it. And he was extremely disappointed. He didn't say, oh, what a great thing. You're great humility. You're not at all. He was, oh. And I could tell he was disappointed. So he phoned me back about something, and I realized I'd spoken out of turn. So I sort of said to him, look, I think it would be good for the UK to have a bishop over here.
Yeah, you were young. You were older than you. There were many older. You were the youngest.
Jack, I wasn't as pure, as spiritual as I should have been. That was my view, and I'm sure it's true view. But, you know, he didn't have a lot of people to choose from for that position. There's lots of very good people, but it was difficult for him. So I realized that. I realized this isn't great. This isn't what he wants. As a matter of fact, he went off then, because it wasn't just me, it was his wife, Lady Monique King. as well. He was going to consecrate and eventually did consecrate. He checked with the Lord Babaji without me knowing, and he approved it. And he came back and told me. So I thought, look, okay. So I said, look.
So the Lord Babaji, so you chatted to the Lord Babaji about, listen,
That move,
Yeah.
well, it had to be someone. And
I was thinking about
I'm
you.
looking at it. No, this isn't an exposition of me at all. This is just the way it was. So I learned a big lesson, and I said to him, okay, it's up to me. I said it'd be very good for European headquarters to have a bishop and have one there. It's very good. It's a great honor, and it's up for me to go out of my way to deserve it. What I said to him.
Future.
He said, and then he said, that's the right attitude. Because it's no help to him being incredibly humble. Oh no, I'm not worthy. How does that help him? Even if it's true, which
you're definitely not worthy. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. And it's work in progress now. That was then. Yeah. I'm still working at it, but it was a big lesson. And that's what I'd say to people. There's anyone can do anything, even if you're not worthy of it. If it's come along, it must be a karmic moment, and it must be possible. Because I've come across this with the Aetherius Society. People say this is advanced, this is difficult. I don't think I can do it. I don't think I'm able to do it. I do believe it.
It's a very small organization. I mean, people don't appreciate
it. Is small, and and we can do a lot with a small number, but obviously the more the merrier of the right. But I will say to them, look, it's come along, so you must be able to do it, whether you're worthy or not.
Yeah.
Or it couldn't happen. That's a karmic impossibility. And I think people can be encouraged by that.
Thinking about, your position, and, for reading the biography, which is, it's a fantastic read. And that I don't know if you have any past life memories, but Dr. King must look at you and be able to see, know what you had for breakfast, many lives ago. And so he probably saw that, you ran a monastery in France very well, in that last time around, and you ran a huge in China. You were in charge, you were serving the king very well there. And so
he didn't he told me and Monic one place that we'd been, he's a certain country that we'd both been. I have a few memories. And there is one particular person I actually remember being, and he did mention that person to me more than once. I remember that person was killed while doing their work. And I do remember him saying, I went to him once to defend certain people who had made a mistake, which wasn't always helpful to him. For me to do that, because he knows about people far better than I do. So I said, well, yeah, but they were trying to help. And he said, well, so were the people who killed so and named that person. So he would do that.
You never told him that name. You never told him.
I'd never told him, although he did sit down and one dinner and said, tell us all about so and named him to me. He said, Richard, tell us about so and so. But he wasn't the sort of master who would tell you. I mean, I'll give you an example. He would do it all subtly, and he didn't need to. He was almost above that. For example, I'll give you an example. When I was in America, I'd very often have the honor of not of eating with him, but sometimes if he was watching a television program, with him. Now, when he was watching a television, which might be a film or something, he would very often be doing something else as well. But he'd be sitting there and he'd be watching. Well, I had a really bad headache, and he had a tannoy system, and where I was staying on the property in America, he could tannoy into the room and said, Richard, come over and we're going to watch so-and-so, this film. And I said to him, well, I'm really sorry, master, but I've got a really bad headache. If you don't mind tonight, I just think I ought to rest up. He said, get over here, come over here. So on the face of it, you think, that's callous, that's callous. And so off I go, and he says, sit down. And then he says, have a drink, which was the last thing I wanted, at that point. And he poured me a drink. And to be polite, I took the drink. I was drinking it quite slowly, but I had a drink. He had a drink. We were watching this thing. And right the way through it, he was nudging me, in the ribs. You think, you got a headache, that the headache went completely. This is a small story, but what I'm illustrating more, not is his healing power, which we know about, but his methodology. So then it came to a break in the film, and I said to him, thank you so much for that healing. My headache has completely gone. I feel absolutely fine now. And he said, what healing? Don't be silly. Now let's get on. And so that's the way he was. He didn't go announcing he was doing this for you, that for you. He worked subtly. And, he'd know about certain lives. He wouldn't necessarily let you know which lives he knew about.
And the future.
He made his own judgments. But, the way I look at it, none of us were really equipped to be followers of him.
Well, Jesus had anneps, as his disciples. They
Some
were
of them, yes. St. Peter was, possibly Judas was. We know that St. John is now, may have been then, I don't know. And we know that St. Paul is a planetary one now, but he wasn't around Jesus. My own opinion, again, my opinion, I want to stress, I can't believe he was in that life, because I don't think an avatar would have persecuted, killed Christians, even in the early part of their life.
Yeah.
But there was an example, though, of someone who completely changed. I mean, it's a beautiful thing. Well, whatever your religious beliefs, he changed. He heard the voice. We all know the story of Damascus, blindness, changed completely and became the most vigorous, possibly other than St. Peter, and, campaigner for the church and the spreading of the message and on earth, and may, for all I know, he may have had lives after that, but he's certainly a planetary one now. But yeah, I get your point.
It's all about karma with Dr. King now. Everything was karma.
Everything was karmic.
Having ordinary people as a...
He did. And since we're being honest, some people couldn't, or felt they couldn't cut it and didn't stick around him for one reason or another, particularly if they were at the highest levels or got very close to him.
Well, it was hard work.
It was hard work. It was extremely demanding. And, he didn't say this at all, but I always feel none of us really fully lived up to his expectations of us. But it's not something that he said to me that at all. He was very generous. In fact, one thing I discovered a few things actually, about that. And one was that he could be very forgiving. He could be strict, as I mentioned, very strict and demanding. And, I'd get a phone call, I want you here in 20 hours, not 24 hours. Get over here. I need you now.
To America.
America. Yeah. I might die, he would say. He never took anything for granted. He had a dangerous mission, and I'd be up and I'd go no matter what else I was doing or not doing. So if you were in that sort of close circle with him, it was very pressured. And the people who looked after him in Santa Barbara and so on, they were on call all the time, 24 hours for him. I was on call 24 hours a day, but I wasn't always in the same country as him. So it was a full-on thing. It was a difficult thing, but I did find him also, he could be extremely compassionate and very forgiving. You could make a mistake. I certainly made mistakes, and he would forgive me. And I had to realize myself, because you could easily then be lulled into feeling I've been forgiven by the master, so it's all okay. But it's not. I don't think it is okay. I think it's great. It's wonderful of him, and we can all move on. But I've still got to do something. I've got to make up for that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I learned. And another thing that I'll quickly say this is that he was always right about anything that mattered. He wasn't always right about every detail, every fact. He spoke in good faith. He might get a name slightly wrong, a date slightly wrong, and everyone can misspeak. I certainly do at times. So, but if it mattered, even if initially he made a decision that wasn't quite right, he'd always correct it and he'd always put it right. And I got very, very used to that. I could give quite a few examples of it. So I did find that after he left us, physically left us, he hasn't left us at all, I had to adjust, because the very best of human beings aren't like that. It was a very unusual quality, extremely rare, if not unique.
Wow, it's incredible. I mean, I hope your biography is coming out soon, because that's, if Peter and Paul and John had,
Well, not
one
a
of those.
planetary one. I can assure you of that.
No, but I mean, it's difficult to appreciate Dr. King now because people don't know about. I mean, I've read it when I remember 2 years. I could hear the certain transmissions that relate to
Yes.
his real mission.
Yes.
So
Yes.
even I don't understand fully what he like Jesus created for the teaching and also for a much more important
To die,
mission.
basically to die.
Yeah, to manipulate karma. And Dr. King had an even more important mission. That
Did.
the teachings are just enough for me now.
Stunning. They're stunning.
Stunning.
But I want to give credit to you, Jack, and other people who didn't meet Dr. King. And I give great credit to those people, especially those who really dedicate themselves. And we have some people here in London, and there's some people in other parts of society who are totally dedicated. They've given up, their financial interests, sometimes their, opportunities in their own private lives in order to dedicate themselves on this path without having physically met him. And I haven't done that. I physically met him. So I think credit is due to them, and his credit is due to someone like yourself who's found the society, is out there putting it out. And some ways people might relate to you more than they relate to me. There's things I could teach them, yes. But, they're in the same situation that you're in. So they can relate to it. Okay, you've dedicated yourself to this. You've discovered this. You didn't meet Dr. King physically, or let's say if you did it on the other realms. That's not impossible. That isn't impossible at all. You could have even, let's see, how old are you?
43 now.
Okay. So you could easily have been in the Aetherius Society before you came to this. Or the Aetherius Society has existed on the other realms for a long time. So that's all possible. But I think you carry a lot of credibility, and all power to you. And I take my hat off to you. I take my hat off to everyone. Those who are dedicated, who knew him and have stuck the course, which not everybody did. One or two didn't, but they've come back, and that's not easy to do either, because you have to admit your own errors to yourself, if not to anyone else. And people who, like you found him now. Great. And that'll go on for centuries, I hope. And eventually it will be understood as it is, I believe, on the highest realms, the very highest realms. I think it's
very low, not many population.
Yeah, probably so. But I don't think there's anyone there who doesn't accept Dr. King. Doesn't mean their main thing is the Aetherius Society, because they might have other tasks to do for other ascended masters, for example, or something specific. But they will also accept the society, and some of them, I believe, are really studying the texts we're talking about there and are completely committed to the Aetherius Society. And that's a wonderful thought too.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I think thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure. Thanks for speaking to me. And God bless all your listeners.
All right. Thanks very much, Richard.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.